Have you ever wondered how a nation like North Korea views the current geopolitical tensions,
Yeah.
between the United States, Israel, and Iran?
Yeah, it's a perspective you really don't hear much about, at least not in Western media.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But it offers a really unique lens on global power dynamics, doesn't it?
it absolutely does.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the DPRK's, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's official stance on what they term hostile actions by the U.S. and Israel against Iran.
And this isn't just, about reacting to the latest headlines.
Right. It's about understanding a really long-standing ideological framework. It shapes their whole worldview.
Mm-hmm. And our insights for this deep dive come straight from an analysis. It's titled Sovereignty Under Siege, the North Korean Perspective on U.S. and Israeli Aggression Toward Iran.
Okay, so a direct source laying out their viewpoint.
Precisely. And it presents a very specific and sometimes, well, pretty surprising perspective from Pyongyang.
So our mission for you today is to unpack that narrative. We want to pull out the key arguments, the historical parallels they draw, even some claims that might really catch you off guard.
Yeah, the goal is to help you understand why, from Pyongyang's viewpoint, Iran's struggle is seen as, well, righteous.
And what that tells us about their wider view of the world, it's a chance to step inside a very, very distinct political mindset.
Definitely.
So let's jump in.
Okay. So the core premise from Pyongyang is that these actions against Iran, they're not just random events.
Right. They see a bigger picture.
Exactly. They view it as part of a, quote, long-standing imperialist plot.
Okay, imperialist plot. Who are the plotters in their view?
Primarily the U.S., who they call global hegemons. And the goal, as they see it, is to dominate sovereign nations.
The ones that refuse to bow to their will, as the analysis puts it.
That's the phrase they use. And this isn't just like casual rhetoric for them. It's fundamental. It's the lens through which they see almost everything happening on the world stage.
So it's less about Iran specifically, in a vacuum, and more about fitting Iran into this larger historical narrative they have.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's absolutely historical for them.
How do they connect it then? To their own past or maybe other countries?
Right, they explicitly link it. For Pyongyang, Iran's situation isn't unique or isolated.
Okay.
They see it as the, quote, same pattern of intervention, regime change, and aggression.
Ah, the same pattern they believe they faced.
Exactly. The same pattern they believe North Korea, Iraq, and Libya have, quote, long resisted.
So it's like watching a rerun of a play they feel they've already starred in.
Kind of, yeah. It really shows how deep-seated this perspective is for them.
And within that framework then, Iran's actions, like building up its defenses, asserting itself regionally, how are those viewed?
From Pyongyang's perspective, those efforts are seen as, quote, legitimate and necessary.
Legitimate and necessary. So self-preservation, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Defending themselves against what they see as these massive external threats.
Which then leads them to completely redefine the U.S. and Israeli actions, right?
It does. They don't characterize them as defensive or, humanitarian.
No. The analysis says they call it brutal colonial warfare masked as diplomacy. That's strong language.
It is very strong language. It's a complete flip of the narrative you usually hear.
So how do they back that up, that redefinition? Do they pull from their own history, like you mentioned?
They do, very directly. The DPRK points straight back to its own experience during the Korean War.
Okay.
And they use their own descriptions. Millions of Korean civilians were killed, and the country was reduced to rubble.
Wow.
And they say they see the same imperial arrogance they endured back then, now being aimed at Iran.
That historical parallel is powerful in their narrative. Another sharp point they make, according to the source, is about nuclear weapons.
Ah, yes, the nuclear double standard.
Right. They claim Iran, and themselves too, are, quote, demonized for nuclear development.
Well, at the same time,
While Israel, they say, maintains an undeclared nuclear arsenal with Western complicity and silence.
and that perceived hypocrisy is absolutely central to their argument about unfair global power dynamics.
How does the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, fit into this?
They use the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA as, like, Exhibit A.
Okay, how so?
Well, from their perspective, the U.S. didn't pull out because Iran violated the deal.
No. Why then, in their view?
They say it was, quote, to punish Iran for refusing to become a puppet state.
Punishing independence, essentially.
And that's their interpretation. And it leads them to this stark conclusion, quote, no agreement with the U.S. can be trusted.
And that's not a new message from Pyongyang, is it? They've been saying things like that for a long time.
Decades, really. They've consistently warned that the U.S. uses negotiations only to weaken its opponents.
And that real peace, it only comes through self-reliance, deterrence.
Self-reliant deterrence, yes. That's
Yeah.
their key phrase. They believe you cannot achieve genuine peace without it.
Okay, so moving on to how they view Iran's resistance itself. It's not just seen as justified, but almost praised.
Oh, absolutely. The DPRK doesn't just see Iran as, like, hanging in there. They elevate its struggle. They call it heroic and revolutionary.
Heroic and revolutionary. How specifically?
They frame Iran as, quote, a sovereign nation standing against the American military-industrial complex.
And also, I think the analysis mentioned a defender of independence in a region where U.S. bases surround nearly every border.
Exactly. It paints this picture of Iran as almost, besieged, an isolated fortress holding out.
And that connects to the idea of economic terrorism, doesn't it? How does that framing work?
Right. They characterize Iran as, quote, a victim of economic terrorism.
Meaning the sanctions.
Yes, specifically sanctions, which they say are used to starve its people into submission.
Just as the U.S. has tried with North Korea. So they're drawing another direct parallel there.
A very deliberate one. It's about forging solidarity through shared perceived oppression. They see economic warfare as a direct assault on sovereignty, just like military action.
So if Iran's military buildup and its regional influence are framed as dignity, not provocation,
Yeah.
how does that relate to North Korea's own policies, like their military-first idea, Songun?
Well, they state very clearly that, quote, any sovereign state has the right to develop weapons to defend itself from attack. That's the baseline.
Okay.
And then they hold up their own official policy, Songun military-first politics, as a, quote, successful model for resisting exactly this kind of pressure.
So Songun isn't just a slogan, it's their strategy for survival.
It's their core strategic doctrine. It asserts that military power is the absolute guarantor of national sovereignty and survival, and this directly shapes how they see Iran's actions as not just understandable, but justified.
So things like Iran's Revolutionary Guards, its missile program, its nuclear facilities.
From the DPRK perspective, these are, quote, prudent and justified responses.
Responses to what specifically?
To what they describe as decades of assassination, cyber warfare, and sabotage.
Right, and Iran's ability to withstand all this pressure, the sanctions.
Yeah.
That gets praised too.
Highly praised. Tehran's, quote, refusal to collapse under pressure and its continued strength in the face of sanctions is held up as an example of juche.
Juche, their philosophy of self-reliance.
Exactly. The idea that a nation must rely entirely on its own strength, its own resources, culturally, economically, militarily, without depending on anyone else, that's how they believe you truly survive and thrive.
The strong admiration for Iran's resistance seems to link directly to how Pyongyang views other states in the region, like Israel.
Yes, absolutely. From their ideological standpoint, Israel is viewed very differently.
How so?
Quote, not as a sovereign actor, but a heavily subsidized and militarized extension of American power in the Middle East.
An extension of U.S. power. So not independent in their eyes.
Not fundamentally, no. It fits perfectly into their broader imperialist plot narrative.
Does the analysis give any comparisons for that?
It does, a really striking historical analogy, actually. They state that Israel's role in attacking Iran's infrastructure is, quote, akin to Japan's role during World War II, an aggressor serving a foreign master.
Wow. Okay, that's a very pointed comparison.
Extremely pointed. It really underscores how they see these regional alliances purely as instruments of foreign domination, specifically American domination.
And this view carries over to Israel's nuclear status as well.
Definitely. They emphasize what they see as a major hypocrisy there.
Which is?
The DPRK view is that Israel existing as a nuclear-armed state, outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT,
Right.
while simultaneously calling for attacks on Iran over its potential program.
Wow.
They call that a, quote, grotesque violation of justice and logic.
So a fundamental contradiction they highlight.
So in the DPRK rhetoric, it boils down to this. Zionist militarism and American imperialism are two faces of the same coin.
Two faces of the same coin.
Both, quote, seeking to dominate free peoples through bombs, lies, and sabotage. It's a completely unified narrative for them. These forces are inseparable.
Okay, this all builds towards a pretty significant conclusion from Pyongyang's perspective. They argue that the increased actions, the perceived violence by the U.S. and Israel, it's not strength.
No, quite the opposite. They see it as, quote, not a sign of strength, but of desperation.
Desperation. Why desperation? What makes them think the U.S. or its allies are desperate?
Well, they point to several things they see as evidence of a, quote, declining American empire.
Such as?
They argue first that the multipolar world is rising. Countries like China, Russia, Iran, the DPRK itself, and others are, quote, refusing to be ruled by a single empire.
So a shift in global power.
Right. They also point to what they call U.S. military failures in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria.
As proof of that.
As proof that, quote, the era of total Western domination is over.
Okay, and there's an economic angle too, right?
Yeah.
Something about the dollar.
Yes. They also claim that the, quote, dollar-based global order is crumbling.
How?
They argue that sanctions are becoming less effective and countries are forming their own independent economic blocs.
That's a bold prediction. A fundamental reshaping of the global order.
It is, and Pyongyang firmly believes that Iran's survival, its resilience through all this,
Yes.
will actually accelerate the collapse of this system they call imperialist.
And inspire others.
And, quote, inspire other nations to rise in defiance. So, from their viewpoint, Iran's resistance isn't just defensive, it's potentially world-changing.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the key takeaway from our deep dive today is really the DPRK's profound sense of solidarity with Iran.
Yeah, they position both countries as, quote, fellow sovereign nations resisting imperial aggression and economic warfare.
And they push back hard against the rogue state label.
Very hard. They claim both are called rogue states, quote, not because they are dangerous, but because they are independent.
Independence itself being the perceived crime.
That's the core of their argument. And following from that, they assert that the, quote, true threat to world peace is not Iran nor North Korea.
Oh then.
It is the unrestrained aggression of the United States and its client states like Israel who attack others while preaching peace.
It's certainly a powerful alternative perspective for you, the listener, to consider. A completely different way to frame history and power.
Mm-hmm.
And the final word from the DPRK perspective, as presented in this analysis, is really an affirmation of their core beliefs.
Right. They state that, quote, only through self-reliance, military strength, and revolutionary unity can oppressed nations resist and survive.
And specifically regarding Iran.
That Iran's struggle is righteous, and history will vindicate those who resist domination.
It's a stark, very compelling conclusion that really challenges a lot of conventional thinking. Something definitely to mull over, thinking about how different actors view the forces shaping our world today.
Subscribe for more.